You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm Julie Spare. Anyone in the UK born before the 5th of July 1951 should have received an automatic winter fuel payment from the government by now. The money should arrive by Christmas, whether you've applied for it or not. The winter fuel payment is a tax-free annual amount to help older people meet the cost of their winter fuel bills. The standard rates are £200 per eligible household, where the oldest person is under 80, and £300 per household when someone is over 80. Now, some have argued that the winter fuel payment and other universal benefits for older people can no longer be justified in the light of the deficit and benefit cuts facing non-retired households. The Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg wants to means test the winter fuel allowance and universal benefits for retired households. However, Mr Clegg says age-related universal benefits, such as the free bus pass, winter fuel payments and TV licences for well-off pensioners, would be protected for the duration of the current Parliament. But there should be a debate, which is one reason why I'm joined around the table by Kevin Marr, Associate Editor of Labour Uncut, Mark Thompson, Lib Dem activist and blogger, Christine Ward, who's the chair of Pensions Campaign UK, and on the phone, Anthony Mathan, spokesperson from the Intergenerational Foundation. Should rich pensioners receive money from the government to help pay for their heating? Mark Thompson.
My view is that pensioner benefits, I think they should be means tested. I feel that there's no justification for protecting older people carte blanche from the worst effect of the cuts that basically everyone else is going to have to suffer. I actually think it's almost a form of kind of generational pork barrel politics, because older people vote in much higher numbers than younger people. And I do feel that that's one of the main reasons why they end up being protected from most of these cuts. And I do feel that I just struggle to see the justification for, I think there are 450,000 older people who are higher rate taxpayers, and yet they will just automatically receive this £200 or £300 a year for fuel payments. I'm sure plenty of them don't even spend it on fuel because they probably don't need to.
There is an argument, though, that they are, like you just mentioned, they are the higher rate tax earners, so they've paid their taxes. Is there not an argument for them they receive the winter fuel payments?
Well, I just don't agree with that. I mean, I think even in the good times it's difficult to justify that, but especially at the moment when there's such a squeeze on public finances, when we're seeing, people of working age having their benefits frozen at a 1% rise for 3 years, which we all know means effectively a cut. I mean, you can call it a rise, but really with inflation at 2.5%, 3% and floating around that level, it's effectively over the next few years a cut of around 6%. I just don't see how it can be justified.
OK, I think I'm going to come to Christine Ward because you represent a lot of pensioners in your group. And what do you think about Nick Clegg's ideas to means test the winter fuel payments?
In principle, I don't really have a problem with that, apart from the fact of defining what is a rich pensioner, because if we're talking 450,000 on the higher rate of tax, exactly how much money that is going to save by the time you've means tested 11, 12 million pensioners. And also an easier way around some of this, particularly winter fuel allowance, which is a bone of contention. If you're going to start means testing all pensioners and you're going to start taking benefits away from them that they've already paid into considerably longer than new pensioners are going to have to pay into the system, then the question is then, what is going to happen to that money? Our members would be in favour of means testing if the money that was saved by the government was actually, added to the very, very low end of pensioners to increase their standard of living, but that's unlikely to happen.
I'm going to come to you now, Anthony Mathan from the Intergenerational Foundation. Do you think that the winter fuel allowance should be means tested?
I can't really disagree with either of the previous speakers, Mark or Christine. We believe it should be means tested. I think that the standpoint of the intergenerational foundation is that past generations and the sort of baby boomer generations have been in the habit of making themselves promises which are really kind of unsustainable. What we're concerned about most of all is the way that these liabilities are going to have to be paid for by future generations or younger generations or even generations not yet born. The winter fuel allowance is just one particular case where there's been a very generous handout, really, means tested introduced by the Labour government. It just seems wrong when the government, for deficit reduction, are currently squeezing younger people in a variety of ways, like removing the EMA, which was designed to help people from less well-off backgrounds get into further education. And also university tuition fees, all those things. The pressure is on younger people at the moment, whereas the government seems, for reasons that I suppose, the grey voting power that Mark mentioned, the government seems prone to favour the older generation.
Okay, Kevin Marr, then, you're the Associate Editor of Labour Uncut. What should these pensioners be protected from having to fill in forms to receive a winter fuel allowance?
Yes, I think they should. Excuse me. I mean, it seems slightly strange for an avowed social democrat like myself to argue the case that wealthier pensioners should retain these entitlements. But I think they should, and I think they should for a very important principle that I think removing these entitlements, means testing these benefits, is a decisive step down the road that sees the founding principles of our welfare state broken up. Those principles of universalism, those principles of social insurance. I mean, you alighted a minute ago, Juliet, about many of these pensioners having paid into the system. That's the basis of our welfare state, that you pay in and everybody pays in and then you draw out when you need to. Now that does seem slightly counterintuitive when you've got some pensioners who are wealthy, some pensioners who don't spend their winter fuel payments on winter fuel, they spend it on other things as well. But I mean, I think we have to be very careful here that there's right through the debate around welfare reform are lots of apocryphal tales of what people do and what people don't do, but often very little evidence. Now, I mean, I think what sits behind some of this desire is twofold, really. I think Mark's argument and the Nick Clegg argument about utility, that actually we should be targeting resources at poorer pensioners, is superficially attractive, and I don't disagree necessarily with that, but I think it stores up this long-term problem that we erode the foundations of the welfare state, which leads us to the other driving force, which is, I think, frankly, elements within the coalition having an ideological drive to remove those founding principles, to sort of dichotomise British society between the strivers and the skivers. And I think if we go down this road, it starts to build this narrative that you've got a section of the population who benefit from the welfare state and from benefits, and a section of the population who pay for that. And if that section of the population don't seem to benefit from it, it doesn't take a great leap of logic for them to say, actually, why are we paying for this? And I think that's the great danger politically, as I would see it, and that's why I, as a social democrat, perversely as it may seem on this particular issue, would support retention.
Mark Thompson.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably a little bit like Kevin just said, that there's a superficial, or in his perception, a superficial attractiveness to what I was saying. I also think there's a superficial attractiveness to what he was saying. But I do think about this whole strivers versus skivers narrative. I actually agree with him that I think George Osborne hasn't been doing he hasn't been doing himself any favours or his party any favours with that whole narrative to do with keeping benefits down for for working age people, and for trying to divide the working against the workless. I think that is a really bad thing, and I don't agree with that. But I don't think that that's what's happening here. Kevin himself used the phrase in the middle of what he was saying, that you pay in and then you draw out when you need to. I wrote that down, when you need to. These people don't need to. The people who are getting this money, who are earning, 30, 40, 50, 60,000 pounds a year, do not need £200 or £300 from the taxpayer's purse. Money, let's be honest, because in the end, it is a zero-sum game. If that money is given to them, it can't be given to other people who may need it more. And I just think that this idea that you have this principle that everyone pays in and everyone must get money out, I just don't agree with. I think people who can afford to pay for the fuel themselves, afford to pay for the TV licences themselves, which we haven't mentioned, anyone over 75 gets a free TV licence. Again, I struggle to see the justification for that. Just because you happen to be over 75, I don't see why that should be. I'm not saying we shouldn't have these benefits at all. Of course we should. But I just think it's difficult to see how we can justify paying them to everyone in this way. And I think there are all kinds of ways in which we can help older people who would struggle to fill out forms. I mean, Citizens Advice, various charities, members of the family of the older people and so on. And I would really hope that people wouldn't fall through the net. But I just think with the billions and billions of pounds that are spent on these universal benefits, we have to do something about it. It just isn't fair.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Juliet Spare, and we're talking about whether rich pensioners should receive money from the government to help pay for their heating, the winter fuel payment. I'm joined by Kevin Marr, Associate Editor of Labour Uncut, Mark Thompson, a Lib Dem activist and blogger, and on the telephone, Anthony Martin, spokesperson from the Intergenerational Foundation, and Christine Ward, Chair of Pensioners Campaign UK.
The Department of Works and Pensions is moving more and more to filling in forms online. 40% of pensioners don't have internet facilities, nor do they even have computers or want them. They're not of that generation. There were 660,000 people last year, or pensioners, got the warm home payment of what was this year £130. So if you take 450,000 higher rate taxpayer against 660,000 on the very lowest rate of pension benefits, you're actually not particularly, for the cost of means testing, achieving very much. And I would also like to point out that pensioners retired today will have worked 45 years plus and paid into their national insurance for 45 years plus. New pensioners coming up under the new pension system will only have to make 30 years of payment. Now, when people first started paying into their national insurance, which was part of it, was always recognised was going to be pension contribution, we didn't ever think that by the time we got to 65 or 70, somebody was going to come along and say, hold it, you've made sufficient provisions separately from this money, so we're not going to give you anything else. And if you follow this train of thought in two ways. One, that there'll be no incentive in the future for people to put money away for their pensions because they're going to be penalised by the nature of having things that they thought they were going to be entitled to removed. And secondly, when do we come to a point then that if you're too rich as a pensioner to get your winter fuel allowance, your bus pass, your TV licence, are you going to be too rich to have your National Health Service? When you start penalising people for in whatever way for the fact they've worked and paid into it, then, successive governments in the future can take this to further extremes.
OK, thanks, Christine. Go on, come in, Anthony.
Well,
Anthony Mathen.
The problem about that is that, the government does, of course, have moral obligations towards people who've been paying into the national insurance scheme. But unfortunately, over time, the amount of money paid into the national insurance schemes have been woefully inadequate, and the result is that the liabilities are astronomical now.
I don't think they've been as woefully as inadequate as they have been squandered by successive governments.
Well, that may also be the case. Of course, as everyone knows, well, at least I hope they know, there isn't actually a fund out there. All that money paid in has just been used on other things. It's not as though there's a fund like there is in private pensions that can be drawn on.
There actually is an actuary fund that has £41 billion of pensioners' money stuck in it, which is on loan to the government at the moment. And nobody in the government seems to be able to answer why that money has not been used to improve the basic state pension as it stands now.
So that's a 41 billion. I'm unaware of this. There's a 41 billion fund sitting around there somewhere. But however, I have to say that the liabilities of state pensions are considered to be something like 3.8 trillion. Which is, a vast sum of money that will have to be paid by future generations. So, I think the point is really that I think universal benefits add up to about 2 billion a year currently. That's a significant amount of money from the point of view of current spending. So clearly some squeeze has to take place somewhere in order to reduce the liabilities, it seems that there is a slight problem with this whole area, is that there's a sort of there are certain sentimental attitudes towards pensioners, which is fair enough. I mean,
So is that the problem then? People are looking at this too emotionally. Is it too much sentimentality towards pensioners?
Allowance, there are the real people who are in fuel poverty are not necessarily old people. There are plenty of old people who suffer from that. But also there are a lot of families who are really suffering at the moment from the increase in fuel costs, but they don't get that sort of help.
Okay. Right, I'll come to you then, Kevin Marr. You've been underlining things in a book there, scribbling furiously away.
Yeah, I'm getting a bit worried, to be honest. He's got a book.
I'm good. Shall I start quoting chapter of us? The point I was going to make is that issues about affordability have been there since the very foundations of the welfare state. We had this debate when Beveridge published his landmark report in 1942, 70 years ago this year. The then Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, I'll just read you this very, very quickly, Sir Kingsley Wood, called it an impracticable financial commitment. That was 70 years ago. We still seem to have basically the same welfare state in terms of universality and in terms of the comprehensiveness of it, and we still manage to sort of pay for it. The big issue we've got in British politics is not necessarily about decisions about taking some funding off this group and giving it to this other group or whatever. It's about the fundamental lack of growth in the economy. So it's a false debate in that respect. It's a false choice that we're being presented with by some politicians. And as I understand the argument, the short-term argument about we've got to target resources so that we don't let some groups suffer more than others. But I just think the long-term issue here is a neoliberal-driven conservative agenda, which is about removing the pillars that hold up the welfare state in this country. And if you were a pretty well-to-do person and you realise you've got nothing from the welfare state, you got your higher rate child benefit removed, you had no entitlements as a pensioner, it leads inexorably to a judgment. And Mark was right a little bit about pork barrel politics, and that works in this respect as well, that if you don't get anything out of a system, then you're not going to be compelled to pay anything into it. And I think that is a much bigger issue for British society. And I think when we're looking at a choice at the moment between a sort of one nation vision of British politics, which Ed Miliband is trying to sort of articulate at the moment, and a sort of a diametrically opposite vision of British society, which George Osborne is pushing forward, about strivers and skivers, we can see where this issue, I think, fits within that.
As a Lib Dem activist and blogger, then, Mark, what would your response be to that?
I'm not going to defend the government or the Conservative Party. I'm a Lib Dem activist, and there are certain things that this government have done that I don't agree with. But I don't think, even in my darkest times, that this government is trying to dismantle a welfare state. I just don't see that happening, Kevin. I don't understand where that comes from. And I mean, it's an interesting attack line that I've heard Labour use time and time again, and the Lib Dems are accused of also being complicit in this. I just don't see it. I think, and particularly this proposal is actually trying to make things fairer. It's trying to make sure that it changes the way that things are distributed to be more progressive. I also just wanted to pick up on something that Anthony said as well. He talked about there being a kind of sentimentality around this. And I completely agree with that. And I think another example of this is what happened when there was the proposal in the budget earlier this year to align the tax rates for pensioners and for younger people. And suddenly there was a massive furore about this. It was called a granny tax. Labour went ballistic on it. It was in all the papers, all the headlines. You know, that's such an emotive term, granny tax. All that was happening was that tax rates for younger people being aligned with older people. As far as I'm concerned, that's fair. And actually, in another year or two, the way the tax rates are going, they're going to be back where they were anyway. So it really isn't that much of an issue as far as I'm concerned.
But I think going in the name and the emotional response to it, and the granny tax, and even the pork barrel politics you talk about as to why these make headlines in the first place, and I think why there's the debate over the winter fuel allowance is that it's a very tangible name, and you can attach the emotion to it, which is why politicians use it for debate, for perhaps fairness.
I think when we're talking about the emotiveness of this, we need to remember that the vast majority of pensioners are actually on very low pensions. We pay the third lowest pension in the EU. Now, whenever this, first of all, the granny tax was a media explosion. It wasn't an explosion from pensioners.
No, to be fair, Christine, sorry to interrupt, but Ros Altman was very, very active on the media. She's a spokesperson for one of these organisations that speaks for pensioners, and she was saying that it was very unfair, and there were other people as well. You may not have been doing, but it wasn't just got up by the media. There were spokespeople for pensioners groups also arguing for it as well. Yes,
but then when we follow this one on, whenever this emotiveness, whether it be in Parliament or whether it be in the media, the vast majority of older pensioners get very upset at the fact that, A, they see means testing as being degrading. Somehow they're begging for the money or going to have to beg for it. And secondly, it then starts worrying the poor pensioners and stressing them to a degree that my mailbox gets full of people saying, are we going to lose our winter fuel allowance? Bearing in mind that pensioners spend more time in their house with their heating on than, say, a young couple would who are going out to work. My heating is run from 7 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night because I'm in my house all day. Therefore, my heating bill is considerably higher than somebody who's going out to work.
I mean, I think that's an important point. It is you look at the. I'm just jotting down the benefits that the pensioners are entitled to or do receive. You know, the winter fuel payments, which we're talking about, the free TV licences for over 75s, free bus passes, free eye tests. Now, these are sort of very practical benefits. This is not sort of state largesse. This is very practical benefits, very practical transfers that help, I think, to sort of stave off some other problems that we would get. You know, if pensioners didn't have free eye tests, then there'd probably be a rise in incidences of glaucoma and things like that would go undetected. Now, free eye tests, frankly, cost peanuts. I mean, most high street opticians will do them for a tenner anyway, so there's the peanuts involved there. I mean, in terms of the totality of money that's saved by removing these benefits or means testing these benefits, you know, I think politically the government will end up realising it's not worth the candle because they're going to be on the receiving end of an awful lot of stick about this. But I think in terms of the financial utility of it, in terms of how much money this is actually going to raise, you know, again, I think these are very, very sketchy, back of the envelope sort of figures, and you know, I think they'll probably realise it's not worth the battle.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and I'm joined by Kevin Marr, Associate Editor of Labour Uncut, Mark Thompson, member of the Liberal Democrat Party and blogger, Christine Ward, Chair of Pensioners Campaign UK, and on the phone, Anthony Mathan, spokesperson from the Intergenerational Foundation, and we're talking about whether rich pensioners should receive money from the government to help pay for their heating, the winter fuel payment. There's the practicalities of these benefits and the emotionality of the benefits, but I know, obviously, Mark, you're coming from a very more political perspective and the fairness of it.
If you asked most young people if they want their grandparents' benefits removed, they would say no.
But Christine, again, that's an emotional way of putting it. People's grandparents, that's appealing to emotion. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to be quite hard-headed about this.
It is, but you take away a pensioner's bus pass who doesn't drive. Exactly how are you going to enable them then to get out, particularly they live in rural areas? How are you going to enable them to get out, to get their groceries, etc.? If they're not online, they can't have it delivered. You know, buses are not cheap anymore, and it's more than just a bus pass. It's the social aspect of people getting out of their house.
Yeah.
If you've got to start worrying that you can only do one trip out of your house a week because of cost, you're going to create, as one of the other panelists said, a huge amount of more problems.
But Christine, we're not talking about taking bus passes away from all pensioners. We're talking about taking them away from the richest pensioners, the ones who pay higher rate tax, the ones who are earning at least £42,000 a year. So we're not talking about taking bus passes away from people who then won't be able to get buses. We're talking about people who could then use their money to pay for buses if they wanted to.
So are people who earn £42,000 a year rich?
I have
then?
a bus pass, and I'm 64 soon, and I have never used my bus pass, and I'm certainly not in the category of a rich pensioner. I prefer to drive my car. Alan Sugar does not go out on the bus. Rich pensioners don't tend to use bus passes or even apply for them in the first place.
I think the bus pass issue is a slight distraction. I mean, it's the winter fuel allowance, which is the one that's causing the headlines.
Christine, you've spoken quite a lot. Anthony?
Well, this means testing question, I don't know whether Christine would be able to answer this, but as I understand it, actually means testing can be done through this tax system. It doesn't necessarily mean that people have to be burdened with form filling.
I would agree, and that would make more sense.
Kevin Marr, final word from you then.
We know that pensioners, in terms of the tariffs that they pay for their energy costs, and obviously energy costs have grown exponentially in the last few years, we know that pensioners are often the least able people to navigate the correct tariffs. So removing winter fuel payments will plunge a lot of pensioners into fuel poverty. We've still not nailed this issue about what a rich pensioner is. You could be an upper rate taxpayer, Mark, and as an individual, and we're still talking about a pensioner household here. We're still talking about two people. The idea that people on £42,000 a year are rich and therefore can afford to lose upwards of perhaps £500 a year. I think you're going to be in for a shock if you think you'll get away with that one.
I think people who earn more than £42,000 a year are definitely in the highest earners in the country. I'm not sure of the exact figures, but it's going to be around kind of the top 20, top 50, maybe even top 10% of earners. So I don't think that cuts much ice. Also, pensioners usually have got their houses already paid for, so they don't have those kind of expenses that younger people do as well. I'm not going to sit here and say who are rich pensioners and who aren't, but the tax system makes it clear that anyone who earns the higher rate of tax is considered to be well off enough to pay tax at 40%. And I just think at the end of the day, these non-means tested benefits, they can't be justified, and especially at a time of economic difficulty, we're going to have to do something in order to make sure that this fairness is spread across the generations.
I'd really like to thank all my guests for joining us to discuss winter fuel allowance. Kevin Marr, the Associate Editor of Labour Uncut, Mark Thompson, Lib Dem activist and blogger, Christine Ward, on the telephone and Chair of Pensioners Campaign UK, and Anthony Mathan, spokesperson from the Intergenerational Foundation.
For 3 years, which we all know means effectively a cut. I mean, you can call it a rise, but really with inflation at 2.5–3% and floating around that level, it's effectively over the next few years a cut of around 6%. I just don't see how it can be justified.
OK, I think I'm going to come to Christine Ward because you represent a lot of pensioners in your group. And what do you think about Nick Clegg's ideas to means test the winter fuel payments?
In principle, I don't really have a problem with that, apart from the fact of defining what is a rich pensioner, because if we're talking 450,000 on the higher rate of tax, exactly how much money that is going to save by the time you've means tested 11–12 million pensioners, and also an easier way around some of this, particularly winter fuel allowance, which is a bone of contention, if you're going to start means testing all pensioners and you're going to start...
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Julie Spare. Anyone in the UK born before the 5th of July 1951 should have received an automatic winter fuel payment from the government by now. The money should arrive by Christmas, whether you've applied for it or not. The winter fuel payment is a tax-free annual amount to help older people meet the cost of their winter fuel bills. The standard rates are £200 per eligible household, where the oldest person is under 80, and £300 per household when someone is over 80. Now, some have argued that the winter fuel payment and other universal benefits for older people can no longer be justified in the light of the deficit and benefit cuts facing non-retired households. The Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg wants to means test the winter fuel allowance and universal benefits for retired households. However, Mr Clegg says age-related universal benefits such as the free bus pass, winter fuel payments and TV licences for well-off pensioners would be protected for the duration of the current Parliament. But there should be a debate, which is one reason why I'm joined around the table by Kevin Marr, Associate Editor of Labour Uncut, Mark Thompson, Lib Dem activist and blogger, Christine Ward, who's the chair of Pensions Campaign UK, and on the phone, Anthony Mathan, spokesperson from the Intergenerational Foundation. Should rich pensioners receive money from the government to help pay for their heating? Mark Thompson.
My view is that pensioner benefits, I think they should be means tested. I feel that there's no justification for protecting older people carte blanche from the worst effect of the cuts that basically everyone else is going to have to suffer.
Taking benefits away from them that they've already paid into considerably longer than new pensioners are going to have to pay into the system, then the question is then what is going to happen to that money? Our members would be in favour of means testing if the money that was saved by the government was actually added to the very, very low end of pensioners to increase their standard of living, but that's unlikely to happen.
I'm going to come to you now, Anthony Mathan from the Intergenerational Foundation. Do you think that the winter fuel allowance should be means tested?
I can't really disagree with either of the previous speakers, Mark or Christine. We believe it should be means tested. I think that the standpoint of the Intergenerational Foundation...
I actually think it's almost a form of kind of generational pork barrel politics, because older people vote in much higher numbers than younger people. And I do feel that that's one of the main reasons why they end up being protected from most of these cuts. And I do feel that I just struggle to see the justification for, I think there are 450,000 older people who are higher rate taxpayers, and yet they will just automatically receive this £200 or £300 a year for fuel payments. I'm sure plenty of them don't even spend it on fuel because they probably don't need to.
There is an argument, though, that they are, like you just mentioned, they are the higher rate tax earners, so they've paid their taxes. Is there not an argument for them they receive the winter fuel payments?
Well, I just don't agree with that. I mean, I think even in the good times it's difficult to justify that, but especially at the moment when there's such a squeeze on public finances, when we're seeing, people of working age having their benefits frozen at a 1% rate.